Alright then, so first things first, what is Vue? Well, in a nutshell, it's a very popular JavaScript and TypeScript framework for creating fast and reliable and interactive web apps and single-page applications. Now, it can also be used to create standalone widgets like a search bar or a contact form or any other kind of interactive component that you might find on a website. Now, when we use Vue.js to create websites or widgets, it makes it really easy for us as developers to interact with the user via the DOM, that's the document object model, and also to manage state and data for the application so that we can easily do things like update the UI dependent on user actions like clicking buttons or typing into an input field or something like that. Or we could reflect changes in data such as filtering articles that we show on a blog depending on what a user searches for. In all, Vue is a great framework for creating dynamic, data-driven and interactive websites or user experience. So that's what Vue does for us. Now let's take a look at exactly how it works. So as I said before, Vue can be used for either standalone widgets, which we can drop into a website, or it can be used to create full websites too. Now, in the case of standalone widgets, we'd simply create a Vue component for that widget, for example, a sign-up form, and then that widget could be injected anywhere into our HTML pages. They could even be reused in multiple sections of your website. For example, you could create a widget, which is a sign-up form, and then you could drop that widget into two different places on your website. Now, these widgets would be self-contained, and all of the code and logic required to power that widget would generally be inside of the Vue component itself. And that way, they could then be reused in many different places on your website if needed. Now, the rest of your website might just be static HTML and CSS with multiple pages. It can be built however you wish, but this drop-in sign-up form right here, this would be a widget or component powered by Vue.js. Now, the other more popular way to use Vue is to create full websites with them, which are then made up of several different components and pages. Now, when we use Vue this way, what we're actually doing is creating something called a single page application, or an SPA for short. Now, this is just a term for a website which handles most of the routing between different pages or views in the browser instead of the server. So let's look at exactly how this works. So, for typical websites which don't use Vue or something else similar like React, the following normally happens. First of all, we'd make a request for the website or the web page from the browser by typing in an address in the address bar and hitting enter. That sends a request to a server somewhere. The server handles that request and sends back the HTML page, which we then see in the browser. Now, if we were to click on a link on this page, for example, this one right here, then it would send a fresh request to the server, which would then send back a new HTML page. And the same is true for every link you click on thereafter. So the browser is constantly making requests to the server for every new page, and each request could take some time to do, so the overall experience might be a bit slow. Now, on some pages, we might choose to use Vue to create a standalone widget, like a search bar, which can then be injected into the separate pages. But in this case, Vue is not controlling the flow of the overall website because we're still making requests for every page to the server. Now, when we use Vue to create and control a full website, things work differently. The browser still makes the initial request to get a web page from the server, and that web page is normally a blank, bare bones HTML document. It normally contains virtually no visible content, but it can do sometimes. And with that web page, we also get back our Vue JavaScript bundle. Now, this Vue JavaScript takes full control of the website now in the browser, and it renders the different Vue components that are needed for that page, like a navbar component, an article component, and a sidebar component. And it also takes over all of the linking and routing to other pages on the site too. So if I was to click on a link in this page to /contact, for example, Vue would intercept that request that we make right here, so it doesn't go to the server, and instead Vue handles this in the browser instead. And then what it would do is render a contact component to the browser. Now, it does this really quickly, so it means the website feels much faster and smoother when you're navigating from one page to the next. Now, when we create a website in this way, we call it a single page application because it's only ever a single HTML page sent to us by the server initially, and after that Vue injects whatever components are needed for that page, and it intercepts any link clicking and requests to other pages and just changes the components that we show based on the URL that we navigate to. Now, most of this course is going to focus on creating full Vue websites, single page applications. So we'll learn much more about how they work as we go forward. But to begin with, to get us familiar with the basics of Vue, we'll just be using it to create standalone widgets or components. And that way we can easily jump right into using Vue with very little setup. Okay then, so before we start talking too much about Vue, I just wanted to address a few major updates to the Vue framework in version 3. Now, you may never have used Vue 2 before, which is fine. You don't need to be familiar with Vue 2 before you start this course. And in that case, much of this video might not make much sense, but don't worry. I'll explain all of these features in more detail later in the course, and we'll be learning everything from the ground up. But for those who have used Vue 2 before, I thought this would be a nice way to give you a brief overview of what's new in Vue 3. So, the Vue team have been working on version 3 for what seems like an eternity, but it's finally here and it comes with some nice improvements. The main one is the introduction of the composition API, and this basically opens up a whole new way of creating Vue apps. It improves reusability, organization, and readability of our code, especially for more complex components. Now, it does this by giving us access to a setup function inside components where we can tap into some of Vue's core functionality. It's a really nice addition to the framework, and we'll be using it a lot later in the course, mainly in the second half of the course. The next big change is that we can now have multiple root elements for a component template. So before, we'd have to wrap everything inside a single root element inside the template, but now we can have as many root elements side by side as we like. A bit like this, we have two divs right here and they are both root elements. That wasn't allowed in Vue 2, but in Vue 3 this is absolutely fine. So this is definitely a good thing because it reduces the amount of unnecessary HTML code in our web page. Another new feature is the teleport component, and the teleport component basically allows us to render content from one component in a completely different part of the DOM. So this is really useful for things like modals that you might always want to show at the very bottom of the body tag, but they might be nested somewhere in a component tree in your application. So this is really nice, and we'll see this later on. There's also a suspense component which allows us to handle asynchronous code and components very easily and provide fallback content until any data is loaded, like a custom spinner or loader, for example. And another huge update is that it comes with TypeScript support out of the box. So if you prefer writing your code in TypeScript, now you can. So this is a really good step forward for TypeScript developers. In this course, I will be using JavaScript, but I will be releasing a small Vue and TypeScript course on my YouTube channel soon for free. Aside from those changes, there are a few others like multiple V models for custom components, improved reactivity and performance gains, etc. But the ones I've mentioned here are the big ones, and we'll work with most of them throughout this course at some point, especially the composition API, which is the chunky part of the update. So again, don't worry if none of that made sense and you're completely new to Vue. I won't assume any prior knowledge, and we'll cover everything from the very beginning. If you have used Vue 2 before and you wanted to jump straight into the new stuff, I'd suggest skipping to chapter 9 where we start to talk about the composition API, because the first half of the course, or most of it, will focus on the basics of Vue. So that includes things like data binding, routing, the options API, etc. The second half of the course, I will shift to the composition API and all the newer features which can only be used with Vue 3. In the second half, we'll also use Firebase as a backend for our Vue sites too, so we'll see how Firebase and the composition API can work together nicely as well. So before you start this course, there are one or two things you should already be familiar with, otherwise you might not understand a lot of it. First and foremost, JavaScript. We use JavaScript when creating Vue applications, so you should at least know the basics, things like functions, objects, arrays, asynchronous code. If you don't, then I'd recommend you take my modern JavaScript course here on Udemy. The link is going to be attached to this lesson. You can also check out some free JavaScript tutorials I've got on my YouTube channel as well. And I've got a chapter at the end of this course which teaches you some of the more common JavaScript features that I'll be using. Things like array methods, import, and async and await. So check out those videos if you want to brush up your knowledge at any point. Secondly, you should also know HTML and a little bit of CSS. We're going to be building websites, and HTML and CSS are the core building blocks of websites. So it definitely helps to understand those two things. If you want to learn HTML and CSS, I've got a whole crash course for free on my YouTube channel. And again, the link to that is going to be attached to this lesson. If you're comfortable with all that, then you're definitely ready for this Vue course. But if at any point you want to learn more about a particular CSS feature or JavaScript method, then chances are I'll probably have a tutorial about it on my YouTube channel. So definitely check out that for any complimentary videos. And again, I'll leave all the links to the courses and my channel attached to this lesson. So you can use whatever code editor that you like throughout this course, but the one I'm using and the one I would highly recommend is called VS Code, and you can download it for free at code.visualstudio.com. Now, the reason I'm using this is because it comes with some really nice features and it's very flexible, and also there's a couple of packages for VS Code that are going to help us throughout this course that I'll be using as well. The first one of those packages is called Live Server, and that allows us to spin up a local development server to preview our work in. Now, if you want to download it, you just go to the Extensions tab and then search for Live Server. It's this extension right here. You should see an install button. It's already installed in mine. Now, the way this works is if we have an HTML file, which I'll create right now, index.html. Now, if we were to right click inside this file, we could go to Open with Live Server to preview this in a live reload browser. And by live reload, I mean if we were to make a change in the code and save, it would automatically update in the browser. So let's just see this in action. I'm going to type in doc and then tab, and in VS Code, this boilerplates an empty HTML document for us with a head and a body. I'm just going to change this to learning Vue, and then let's do an H1 over here and say hello Vue. Okay, so if I wanted to preview this in a browser, I could save it, right click and go to Open with Live Server, and that's opened up in a browser on my other page. Woohoo! Over here. So there we go. This is how we preview the code in a browser. Now later on, we're going to be using Vue to create full websites, and that's going to come with its own live development server. So we'll be using that instead. But for the first few chapters, we'll be using this local development server instead. So that's the first package I'm using. The second one I wanted to show you is called Vita, and that is this one right here. So you can search for that as well and install this. And this brings some extra features such as syntax highlighting, formatting, and snippets, which help for Vue applications. Now, I'm also using the Material Icons theme to give me these different icons inside the file tree over here. So to install that, you can search for Material Icons, and let me just try and find that over here. It's this one, Material Icon theme, so you can install that as well if you wish. This one's just a personal preference, so you don't need it, but I would definitely recommend both Live Server and Vita for this course. So I've created course files for every single lesson in this course, and they're all hosted on GitHub at this repo right here, Vue 3 Firebase. The link to the course files is going to be attached to this lesson. Now, you don't need to know how to use GitHub. You can just download the code directly from here using this code button. Now, the only thing you need to do is select the lesson you want the code for in the branch drop down right here. So, for example, if you want the code for lesson 14, you'd select that, and then you can go to this button and download a zip folder for that lesson's code. Or you can browse the code on GitHub instead by navigating through the folders and viewing those files. Or if you are proficient in Git, you can clone the repo to your desktop. Either way, all of the lessons which use code will be stored here on this GitHub repository. So again, I'll leave the link to that attached to this lecture. Now, when you reach the section of the course whereby we're using the Vue CLI to generate Vue projects, how you use the course files will change slightly, because later when we start to use the Vue CLI, after you download a lesson, you'll first need to install any project dependencies for it to work. So I'll also leave a small guide attached for your reference to this lesson about how to do that. Alright then, so we said earlier that Vue can be used in two different ways, right? Either to create and control a whole website to create a single page application, or to create standalone widgets which control certain parts of a web page. Now to begin with, we'll just create a standalone widget using Vue and we'll drop it into our HTML page which we have over here. Because that way requires minimal setup. All we need to do is link to the Vue.js library from our HTML file, and then we can jump right into learning Vue without getting bogged down by setting up a whole Vue website. But once we've learnt the basics, we'll move on to creating those fully fledged Vue applications using the Vue command line tools. So first off, head to the Vue documentation to grab the CDN link for the Vue library. And by the way, the Vue docs are really, really good. They're very in-depth and they give you a lot of examples of how to use the different features. So definitely have that as your sidekick to this course. And I'll leave a link to the Vue 3 docs attached to this lesson. Anyway, the first thing I want to do is go to Getting Started over here and then click on Installation. Now, once you've done that, you can scroll down here, and this is the type of installation we're going to be using for now. We're just going to use the CDN. So we need to grab this thing right here. And by the way, you see this where it says at next. That is the version, and it means if you say at next, you're always going to get the latest release. Now, I'm not actually going to use at next. I'm going to use a specific version, which is, let me just paste this in first of all, inside the head, and I'm going to use 3.0.2 because this is the release at the time of recording this video. So if you want everything to behave exactly the same way, you should use the same release, okay? So anyway, now we have that, we can use Vue in this web page. Now, if we wanted to, we could write some JavaScript code at the bottom of our body in a script tag directly inside this HTML file to implement that Vue functionality. But what I'm going to do instead is create a separate file, and I'm going to call that app.js to create our Vue code in, just so we can keep it separate and the HTML file doesn't get messy. So I'm going to do a script and I'm going to link to this. So source is equal to app.js, like so. Oops, that should be in double quotes. And then if we save it and go to app.js, I'm going to do a single console.log statement just to say hello Vue to make sure this is linked up correctly. And by the way, also you'll notice me during this course not use semicolons. Now that is deliberate because Vue in itself doesn't use semicolons, so I'm just going along with that preference. You can use them if you wish. Alright, so I'm going to save that and I'm going to go over to where we have this in the browser. And remember, to view this in a local dev server, you just install the live server package, go to the HTML file and then right click and go to open with live server. That opens it up in the browser over here. So now I'm just going to open up the console by pressing F12 and we can see right here, hello Vue. Alright, so that is our console log. So everything is working. And we also see this message, which shows us that we are using this version right here of Vue. So now we have all of this set up. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and create a Vue app inside this JavaScript file. Okay then, so now we've loaded in the Vue library right here and we're linking to our own app.js file. And this is where we're going to write all of our Vue code. But how exactly do we do that? Well, we start off by creating what's known as a Vue app, and it's the job of that Vue app to control either the full website or just a certain part of a web page. Now, in our case, it's going to control just a certain part of the web page. But first of all, how do we create this Vue app? Well, when we loaded in this Vue library, we get access to a Vue object. And on that Vue object, there is a method called createApp. And that's what we use to create a Vue app. I'm going to store the result of this in a constant called app, but you can call this constant what you want. And I'm going to set it equal to Vue, which we get access to because we're loading the Vue library, and then use the method createApp. And this creates a Vue app for us. So now we have that, but how do we tell this app right here that we want it to control a certain part of the web page? Well, on this app now, we get access to a method called mount, and that method tells the app at what point or where in the DOM to mount this application. So I could say app.mount, for example, and pass in some kind of selector like #app. And that would tell Vue to take our app instance that we have right here and mount it in the DOM where we have some kind of element with the ID of app. Now for this to work, we need an element with the ID of app. So let's create that. I'm going to say div and then #app, press tab to create this. And now we have a div with the ID of app. So over here, we're saying create the app and then mount that to this element in the DOM. And then now our Vue app controls anything inside this div. Anything outside of it, it doesn't control. So not here, for example, but anything inside the div, it would control. I hope that makes sense. So this is the part of the web page now that we're controlling with Vue. But what does this mean? Well, it means that any kind of dynamic data that we want to output inside this app element, or any events or interactivity which occur inside it, like click events or mouse move events, all of that will now be controlled by our Vue app. For example, if the user clicked on something inside this element, inside here, like a button or something else, then we could react to that inside our Vue app. We could set up a function to handle that click event. Or if we have some data, like a list of book titles, we could use our Vue app to make that data accessible inside this element so we could output it to the browser. Now, the way we do all this is by first passing in an object into the createApp method. Now, this object represents something called a root component in Vue. It's basically the component that will be controlling the app section, this section right here, of the web page. And inside it, we can set up any data or functions to react to events that we want. Another thing that we can specify inside this is the component template. That is the template that will be rendered inside the app element. So the way we do that is by coming up inside this object and creating a template property, which will be a string. And this string is just going to be some HTML. So for example, an H2, I am the template, close off the H2, and that's it. That is our template now for this component. And what we're saying here is that we want inside this app, inside this div right here, this to be the template that's output. So now Vue is going to mount the DOM at this location. It's going to take our template and inject that into this element inside it. So if we preview now in the browser, we can see I am the template, and I'm going to inspect that to see the HTML, and you'll notice this is the template that we created inside the component. All right, so it's just output inside this div right here with the ID of app. And also notice we have this extra attribute called data-v-app. That just denotes that this is the Vue app. This is where it's mounting the DOM. Okay, cool. Now, sometimes if you have a more complex template with several lines of HTML, it's not always appropriate to create that template right here because this could get very messy. So instead what we could do, and what I'm going to do going forward, is just create the template directly inside the app right here. So for example, I could say H2 and then tab and say I am the template now and save it. And now this will be the template of this component right here. Now, it looks as though we're just making normal HTML, and we are, but what we can do inside this template is actually output dynamic data. And if I save it now, first of all, we'll see that template, but later on, if I try to output something dynamic that we define over here as some data inside our component, we can. So that's what makes it different than normal HTML, and we couldn't do that if we didn't use Vue. So we'll take a look at that and how to do that with data in the next lesson. Alright then, so now we have our Vue app and root component right here, and we're mounting that to the DOM at this position, the div with an ID of app. So now it controls this section, right? Now remember, the whole idea of using Vue is to make our website or widgets in the website more interactive and dynamic. And one part of that is to be able to output dynamic variables or data. So say for example, I wanted to output inside this app element a book title. I could do that right here by creating a paragraph tag and then just typing or hard coding the book title. So the final Empire, for example, is a book title. And yeah, if I save this, I'm going to see it on the screen. Now imagine that this value might change over time or in reaction to user events. We might have a button that a user clicks and that cycles through some different values of book titles. So we see different values right here. Now, to implement that functionality, when we're hard coding a value, would be quite hard to constantly change this. So instead, what I'd like to do is output some kind of variable here instead, a title variable. Now, we can do that in Vue. The way we do it is by creating a data function inside our component. So I could say data, like so, and this, by the way, is shorthand for a function inside an object. We say the function name, parentheses, and then curly braces, and inside that function I can return a data object. So this is important. We must create a function and then return an object inside that function, and the properties we make inside this object are then accessible from our template. So I could create a title property, and that would be the final Empire, and then over in the template that title property would be accessible as a variable. So instead of hard coding it right here, I could do double curly braces to output a variable and then the property name, and this property name matches whatever we called it right here, and then close the double curly braces. So this is how we output a variable or dynamic value inside our template. Double curly braces, the name of the property we want to output, and then close the curly braces. And now if I save this and preview, we don't see double curly braces title, we see the value of that data property, right? And like I said, the benefit of this is that if this value over time changes or changes in reaction to the user doing something, then it's going to update over here because now it's not hard coded. This is a dynamic changeable value. Now we can define as many different properties inside this object as we like. So I'm going to say author, and that will be not the Brandon Sanderson, like so, and also maybe an age property, and I'm going to say 45. I don't know whether that is his age, I've just guessed that, but if I save this now, we can then output those variables inside this template. So let me do that. I'm going to say author first of all, and then I'll do another one which is the age, and now we should be able to see all of those in the browser, and we do, Brandon Sanderson and 45. Now, it doesn't matter what data type you use inside this object. We can use numbers, we can use strings, we can use objects, arrays, booleans, etc. It really doesn't matter. The only limitation we have really is that we can't use those variables outside of the scope of the Vue app, and that is outside of this element right here, because this is where we're mounting the Vue app. So if I try to access a variable outside of that, like the title, this is not going to work. It just outputs title like this because Vue is not controlling this part of the web page, okay? Only the stuff inside this element. Now, if we try to access a variable that doesn't exist, for example, if I change this to titles, then it's not going to find that and it's not going to output anything. It will just be left blank. So let's change that back to title and save it. And now we see everything again. So next up, I'm going to show you how we can update these values in reaction to click events. So a lot of the time when you create a website, you want to be able to react to certain things that happen in the browser. For example, click events. So a user might click on a button and you might want to fire some code when that happens. In my case, I want to fire some code that might do something like increase the value of age or change the value of one of these properties. So to do this kind of thing, to react to events in Vue is really, really simple. The way we do this is by first of all creating a button or any other kind of element. It doesn't have to be a button, and using a directive called v-on. So this is what's known as a directive, and there's many different directives in Vue that do different things. This one right here is to allow us to react to different types of events. Now the V is for Vue, and pretty much every directive starts with that, and then the name of the directive is on, meaning on click or on mouse move or something else. So how do we say what type of event that we want to react to? Well, we use a colon and then click to say we want to react to a click event. So we use the directive v-on, then a colon, then the type of event. Now, like I say, there are more types of events and we'll see those later on, but for now, let's set this equal to something. And this right here inside double quotes is where we can write some JavaScript code. And that JavaScript code will run whenever a user clicks on this button. So what do I want to do when a user clicks on this button? Well, I want to increase the age property right here that we have by 1. So when I click on this, I want some code to run to take this value and up it by 1. Now I can increase that age from the template itself right here because we have access to the age property, or from inside the components. I'm going to show you how to do both, but to begin with, let's do it from inside the template. So I can just take the age property, and I don't have to wrap it in curly braces because this is not being output. It's not actually part of the template that gets rendered to the DOM. Inside here, we're just using JavaScript, and the property right here is age. So we don't need curly braces inside directives when we use the different properties, only when we're outputting them to the browser. So we take that and we can just say plus plus to add 1 to this value. That's how we add 1 to a value in JavaScript, right? So now when I click this, hopefully the age will go up, and it does. Awesome. So I'm going to duplicate this and do one for decreasing the age as well. So decrease age, and then instead of plus plus, it's going to be minus minus. So again, we say v-on and then colon, the type of event, which is a click event, and then the code we want to run, which is decreasing the age by 1. Save it, and this goes up and this goes down. Awesome. They work. So I said that we can react to click events on other types of elements. It doesn't have to be a button. So I could attach one to a div, and I could say right here, v-on, and then click is equal to something. Now, before I go on, I want to show you a shortcut for v-on right here. Because we react to events so much, the Vue team made a shortcut for it, and that is to replace all of this, v-on and the colon, with an @ symbol, and that means the same thing. It means react to some kind of event, and this event can be whatever event you want. It can be a click event or some other kind of event that we will see later on. And again, we can write some JavaScript code in here. So I could say the title is now equal to a different string, so I'm going to use single quotes here, and I'll just say something else and try to spell this correctly and then save it. So if I now refresh, I don't see that. That's because we have nothing inside the div. So we'll say right here, change book title and save it. And if we click on this now, you can see it changes it to something else. Now, I said before that we could also update these properties right here inside the components. So let's do that instead. I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to go back to the components, and I'm going to create a component method. Now, the way I do that is by adding on another property inside this component. Now, it can be above the data function or below it. I'm going to do it below, and it's going to be a methods property. And then any functions or methods that we want to run for this component, we place inside here. So I want to create a method called change title, like so. And again, I'm using the function shorthand, and inside here, what do I want to do? Well, I want to update the value of this. So whenever this function is called, I want to update this. But first of all, how do we actually call this function? Because that's what we want to do when we click on this button right here, or this div. Well, like we have access to the different data properties, we also have access to the different methods from the template. So I could say right here, change title, and now whenever we click on this, it's going to invoke this function right here. Now inside here, I want to update the title. But first of all, let's just console.log you clicked me so we can see this in action. So if I now open up the console and click on this, you can see you clicked me. So this is working. Whenever we now click on this div, because we reference this function and we don't need to invoke it, we just reference it right there. Whenever we click on that, it then invokes the function. So now let's update the title value. Now I can't just say title is equal to something else, and we'll change it to words of radiance. And if I try this out, you'll see it just doesn't work. So we don't get access to title just on its own. We have to say this.title. Now this references the component itself, and then Vue proxies all of these different properties up onto the component instance, so they're accessible from the component. So I can say this.title or this.author or this.age inside our methods to access those, and then I can update them as well. So now this will work. And if I save it and try this over here, change the book title, we can see now it updates to words of radiance. Awesome. Now, one more thing, you can also pass in two functions when we call them arguments. So say I want to pass in a book title here and then update the value of the title to whatever value I pass into the function. All right, so let me do that. Let me do single quotes and say the book title is going to be Oath Bringer. So I'm passing a string into this function. Now, if I save it and come over here, I can accept that into the function right here. And I can say instead of this.title is equal to words of radiance, instead this.title is equal to title, which is the thing I take in. And that can be called whatever you want. You can call it ABC if you want and update it to ABC. But to me, it makes sense to call it title. Save it. And let's see if this works. Change the book title, and this time it changes to Oathbringer, which is the argument we passed in to the function. Now it might be that later we let a user type in the new book name, and then we can pass that new book name in as an argument instead of hard coding it right here. But that's in the future when we learn about forms and input fields. But just know that that possibility is there. But next up, we're going to look at conditional rendering based on our data and certain conditions. Sometimes we only want to show content dependent on certain conditions, right? So for example, if a user is logged in, we might show an account button in the navbar somewhere. If not, we might show a login link instead. Another example would be the hiding and showing of a mobile menu. If a certain condition is true, then we show the menu. If not, then we hide it. So these are both examples of conditional rendering, really useful in lots of different cases. And in Vue, it's very, very simple to do. All we need to do is use a Vue directive called v-if. So say, for example, I want to conditionally show the books on the screen. What I could do is come over here and cut this. I'm going to create a div and I'm going to nest that inside the div. Then I'm going to apply a v-if directive to this div, and we set that equal to something. So Vue is going to look at this and it's going to evaluate whatever is inside the double quotes. If that evaluates as true, then we're going to show this. If it evaluates as false, then we won't show this. So let's set it equal to false first of all. Save it. We don't see it. If I change this to true, then we do see it. So that's how we conditionally show something, by evaluating something inside a v-if directive. Now, obviously, we don't just want to pass true or false in here because that would be pointless. Instead, what I want to do is pass in maybe a dynamic value. So I'm going to come to the components, and you'll see that I stripped out the previous method we had. And what I'm going to do is create a new property. So I'll do that at the top, and this is called show books. And to begin with, I'll set it to be true. Now, what I want to do is say in here, evaluate show books. So it's going to look at that property that we have and evaluate it. If it's true, it's going to show this. If it's false, it won't. So to begin with, we should see it. If I change this to false over here, then we shouldn't see it. Okay? So that's us conditionally showing the books on the screen. But what if I want to give the user the ability to toggle this value right here? So say, for instance, they click on a button. Once they click it, it toggles this from true to false. if they click it again, it toggles it from false back to true. Well, let's try that. I'm going to come down here and create a button. And inside this button, I'm going to do a span tag. And inside the span, I'm going to say hide books, like so. The reason I'm creating a span tag is because we're going to also have another span tag down here later which says show books and conditionally show one of these two. So let's just keep it at hide books for now, but also attach a click event using the @ symbol to the button. And in here, I want to reference a function, which I'm going to call toggle show books. So now I need to create that function over here inside the methods property. So toggle show books, that's a function. And then inside here, I need to say this.show books is equal to false, for example, right? So if I save this now, what's going to happen is when we click on this, it's going to fire the toggle show books and it's going to set that property to false. And then hopefully, because that's false, this will evaluate to false and it won't show this. Hope that makes sense. So hide books, and now we don't see them. But if I click on this again, then we don't get those books back. So instead of setting this to false, what I'm going to do is set it to the opposite of whatever show books currently is. And that way we're just toggling it on and off. So to do that, I can say this.show books, like so. And that would set it equal to what it currently is. But then we can say set it to whatever it currently isn't, reverse it by using the exclamation in front of it. And now if this is true, it's going to reverse that because of this and turn it to false. If this is false, it's going to reverse that because of the exclamation and turn it into true. So now we're just toggling it from true to false and back and forth. If I save this, hide books, it goes, click it again, it appears, etc. Awesome. So as well as this, it makes no sense to have this text saying hide books when the second time around it actually shows them. So I want to toggle what we show here as well. So let me come down here and I'm going to say I want to show this if the value of show books is currently true, because then we want to hide them. So I'll say v-if is equal to show books. So if the books are currently showing, then we'll see this message right here. Now I'm going to create another one of these that says show books. But I only want this to show, this to appear, if this is false. So I'm going to put a little exclamation mark in front of that to say only show this if it's false. Alternatively, you could say if show books is equal to false, like so. But I'm just going to use the exclamation mark, and now if show books is false, then this statement is true. So let me save it and preview. Hide books, show books, hide books, show books. So now we're conditionally showing the books, but also conditionally showing a different message inside the button dependent on the value of show books as well. If it's true, we show this message. If it's false, then we show this message. Now another way of doing this is instead of v-if twice, we can use a v-else. So after a v-if, we can use an else clause, much like you can in JavaScript. So I could say v-else right here, and then inside here say show books. And we don't have to set this equal to anything. All we're saying is, look, if show books is true, show this element, else show this one, right? So we can directly place this after a v-if. So if I save this now, it's going to do exactly the same thing. Hide books, show books, all right? So that's pretty cool. Now, there's one other directive I want to show you, which allows us to conditionally show things on a screen, and that is vShow. And it does something very similar to show books. So I'm going to create a div right here that says currently showing books, right? Now, I'm going to use a directive this time called vShow. So not vIf, vShow. And again, it evaluates this, and if it's true, it shows. If it's false, it doesn't show. So I can pass in show books here. If that property is true, it's going to show this. If it's false, it's not going to. So if I save it, you can see currently showing books. If I toggle that value, it doesn't show now. Then it shows, then it doesn't. So this does what appears to be the same thing. But there is one subtle difference. When we use vIf, this actually takes it out of the DOM completely when this is false, and then inserts it when it's true. When we use vShow, it just uses CSS instead. So it says display block when it's true, and then display none when it's not true. So there is a difference in how Vue achieves this. So I can demo this by coming over here and inspecting this element, and look at this one right here. So you can see it has a style tag attached to it. If we click on hide box, then we see style display none, but the div is still actually there in the HTML. If we click it again, you can see that display none is taken away. Now, if we take a look at this by inspecting, then we hide the box, it actually removes it from the DOM completely. And then when we click this again, it injects it into the DOM as well. Now, generally speaking, adding and removing something from the DOM is more time consuming and expensive in terms of performance than hiding and showing using CSS. So if you had an element that could be hidden and shown a lot over and over, like drop-down content or links in a nav, I would probably use vShow. But if it's something that won't change very often, like if a user is currently logged in, then I would use viv. But it's entirely up to you which one you use. Next up, we're going to dive back into events like the click event, but this time we're going to look at other mouse events as well. Alright then, so we've already seen how we can handle click events, like when a user clicks on a button, by hooking that click event up to a method, which we then define inside our Vue component. Now, we can do a similar kind of thing with different types of mouse events, things like double click, or mouse over, or mouse leave, etc. So let's take a look at a few of those. So first, what I'm going to do is come back to the template, and I've already created at the bottom of the div with an ID of app a BR tag and a comment. And down here, I'm going to create 4 different divs, each one with a class of box, because we're going to use that class to style each one a little bit as well. And we're doing 4 because we're going to look at 4 different mouse events. Now, I've already created styles for this. In the head over here, I've created a style tag, and you can see now that each box has a padding 100 pixels top and bottom, 0 left and right, a width of 400 pixels. We align the text to the center, a background of a light grey color, a bit of margin for each box, and also we display each one as inline block. So if I save this now, we should see those 4 boxes over here. Okay, so I want to now attach a different mouse event to each one. So let me do some text in the middle of each one before I do that. So the first one is going to be a mouse over, and that means basically enter the mouse onto the element. The second one is going to be a mouse leave event. That means exit the mouse. The third one is going to be a double click. And the fourth one is going to be something slightly different, which we'll come back to later. So let's do this one first of all. I'm going to attach an event to this, and remember we can use either VON colon and then the event type, which is mouse over, or we can use instead of this bit the @ symbol, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to set that equal now to a function which we will define over in the component. So let me do this. I'm going to call the function handle event, and then I'm just going to log to the console event like so. So now I can reference that over here, handle event like so. If I save that and open up the console, if we go to mouse over the first one, we see event. If I do it again, we see event. Now while I move around inside the box, nothing happens. It's only when I first enter the element we get that event, okay? So that's the first one. The second one I want to show you is the mouse leave. So let's do that. Mouse leave. And set that equal to the function again, handle event. And in fact, we'll do this one as well. And this is double click. So let's say @dbl click. So that stands for double. And then set that equal to the same function, handle event. Let me save this and preview. And if we come over here, we can now see this one works. When we go into this one, nothing happens. But when we exit, that event fires. And you saw the number 2 here. And then down here, nothing happens when we enter and exit, but if we double click, then we see another event. And we've not done the fourth one. We'll come back to that in a second, but before we do that, I want to talk about the event object as well. So whenever we have events like this that happen in the browser, whether that's double click, mouse leave, mouse over, just a normal click, or any other kind of event, we automatically get access to an optional event object. And that can be taken in as a parameter right here. And it must be the first parameter. So I could type E right here, and you can call it what you want, by the way. You don't have to call it E right here. You can call it EV or event, doesn't matter. But now we can log that to the console. This is automatically passed in as a first argument when we fire an event, when an event occurs. So let me save it and try this again. Now if I mouse over, you see this object right here. It's a mouse event, and if we expand, there's loads of different information about the event. This right here says whether the Alt key was pressed while the event occurred. In our case, it was false. We also have the client X and the client Y. We also have down here whether the control key was pressed, the layer X, the layer Y, offset. There's loads of different things. Also, we have the type down here. That's the type of event that occurred. So let's also log that out. I'm going to say E and E.type, like so. And if I save this, let's try the different events. So this one was mouse over, this is mouse leave, and this is double click, all right? So when an event occurs, you might find it useful to get some of this information. For example, you might want to react to a user when they click something, but only if they're holding Alt as well. Or you might want to update a UI element based on the offset properties, okay? And we will probably use some of these later. And in fact, in a minute, we're going to see an example of that. But before we do that, what if we also want to pass in a custom parameter as well, like we did before? So say, for example, over here, I also want to pass in my own argument. So I can say, for example, I want to pass in a number, which is 5. Now, what's going to happen, because when we did this before, this argument should be therefore the first argument inside here. Now, if I save this, let's see what happens. If I go to the top and mouse enter, we see 5, and E suddenly becomes undefined. So when we pass in our own argument like this right here is the first argument, and we don't get that event object. However, when we're passing our own custom arguments in, we can explicitly say that we want the event object to be passed in as well. And to do that, we say $event, and now this will be the first argument and this will be the second. When we don't pass any arguments in, the event object is automatically the first argument that we receive. But when we do pass our own arguments in, we have to explicitly say that we want the event object in as a parameter as well, and then any of our own parameters or arguments after that. So now, if I save it, we can say E, that will be the event object that we get right here, and we can take in a second optional argument if we want to. For example, we'll call this data, but you can call it what you want. And down here we'll say if data, if that has a value, then we'll log it to the console. Okay, now I do this if check because we don't always have the data. In these other events, we're not passing through any data as a second argument. We're just getting access to the event automatically as a first argument. But in the first one, that's where we pass in the additional argument, the data, okay? So I hope that all makes sense. Now let's try this. And if we mouse over, we can see we get the event object, then the type, and then the data right here, our own custom argument. And these are still going to work the same way. We automatically get that event object as a first argument. Okay, so now we've learned a little bit about that. Let's have a look at this fourth one I wanted to do. Now this one is going to be a mouse move event, and I'm going to set that equal to a different function. This one is going to be called handle mouse move, like so. And I don't need to pass anything into that because we're going to get the event object automatically. Now inside that function, let's define it first. So handle mouse move, like so, and we take in the event object automatically. Inside here, what I want to do is update two properties, and I'm going to create those two properties first. First one is X, and that's the X position within the square that we have the event on, so within this square right here. And then secondly, the Y property. So they're both going to be 0 to begin with. But then what we're going to do is update those when this function is fired, and we can use the properties from the event object to update them. So I'm going to say this.x is equal to e.offset x. So that will be the cursor position within this box. The offset is the offset relative to the top left of the box. So we're going to get that position for x, and we'll do a similar thing for y. So this.y is equal to offset, or rather e.offset y. So now we have those two properties, but we're not doing anything with them. So what I'll do is output them right here. I'm going to say position, and then I'm going to output first of all x, and then secondly y. So to begin with, they're going to be 0, but whenever the mouse moves around the box, and by the way, this is mouse move, not mouse over, so whenever we move at all within the box, it's going to fire the event, and at that point, we're taking the event object to this function, and we update the values of x and y, and they will be reflected right here in the template. So we should see them on the screen. So let's give this a whirl. Let's go to the bottom, and you can see at the minute position starts at 0, 0, but the minute I go in, you can see those numbers update. If I go to the top left, it should be very close to 0, 0, like that. If we go to the bottom right, then that's going to be something like 400 and 200 and something. There we go. Okay, so there we go, my friends. That's how we work with other mouse events that we will be using a lot in the future of this course, and also the event object. So there's another directive I want to show you now, and that one is called v4. And we use v4 to cycle through an array of data and output a bit of template for each item in that array. So imagine we had an array of users, for example, and we wanted to list those on a screen. Then we could use v4 to cycle through that array and output each user in some kind of list. So we're going to do that for books. So we're showing one book right here. But imagine instead of having these three different properties here, if I delete those, imagine instead we had a books property, which was an array, and inside we had a list of books, and each book could be an object. So each book could have a title property, which I'll say for the first one is name of the wind, and each book could have an author property, which in this case would be Patrick Rothfuss. Okay, so that would be one book inside this book array. Now I'm just going to paste in two more. So we have The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson and The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. So now we have three books right here, and we might want to output a bit of template for each one of them. So you might think, well, what we could do is we could come over here and we could say books and then 0 to get the first book, and then dot title, and we could do the same thing for the author right here. And we don't have an age anymore, so let's get rid of that. And then we could do the same for the second book. So let me duplicate this and change this to 1 and this to 1 and so forth. And we could do that for the third book, and it would work. But that's only when we have a small list of books. If this is coming from a database, you might have 50 books or 100 books or even more, and you're not going to do that for each book. And you might not know how many elements you have, so you don't know what number to go up to. So instead, this is where we use something called v4. So what I'm going to do is instead create a UL, and we want to create an li tag for each book object and output that separately. So let me do that, li, and then I'm going to use v-4 on this, and we set that equal to something. Now what we do is say item in, and then whatever you want to cycle through. So I could cycle through books. So I'm going to say item in books. Now this right here, you can call what you want. You can call it book if you prefer, which probably makes more sense, because then we're saying for each book in the books array. So this has to be there, this in, and this has to be last, the array we're cycling through, but the first item can be called whatever you want. So I am going to call it book, and it's going to cycle through each item in the books array, and it's going to output an li tag for each of these books. And inside the li tag, we have access to the individual book as we cycle through them. So for each iteration, this book is going to first be this item, then this, and then this. So we can output the different properties of that book. So I'm going to use an H3 to output the book title. So book.title, like so. And this is the same as this. So whatever you call it here has to be the same here. And then I'm going to do a paragraph tag for the author. So book.author, like so. Save that, and we should see an li tag for each one, which we do. And this still works, this toggle that we had before, because we're still embedding this inside a VIF. So this is how we cycle through data and output a bit of template for each item in that data array. And we will be using that a lot as we start to make projects, because a lot of the time we're working with collections of data, whether that be users or some other kind of resource like blog posts or chats or messages. We want to cycle through them, and that's when we'll be using V4. So now I'd like to talk about a concept known in Vue as attribute binding. And attribute binding is when we bind dynamic values to HTML attributes. So say for instance we had an anchor tag. The href is an attribute. What if I wanted the value of that to be dynamic? Normally when I create a link, I'd put in a website address here. So http://www.thenetninja.co.uk. And right here, I'll just say best website ever. And that would be how I create a normal link. But this is hard coded, this value. If I want it to be dynamic, I need to do something else. Now, the first thing I would do is take this value and create a data property. And I've already done that. I've created this URL data property, which is thenetninja.co.uk. So what if I wanted to output that URL data property inside this href right here? Would I just say URL? Well, no, that's not going to work. That's just going to literally think that URL is the href. And if I inspect this, we can see the href is URL. So that doesn't work. Well, what about curly braces like we do in the template? Will that work? Well, again, no. The literal href is going to be curly braces URL. So in order for this value to be dynamic, we have to do something else. We have to do what's known as data or attribute binding. So the way we do this in Vue is by using a directive called v-bind, and then we use a colon and attach it to whatever attribute we want to bind data to. So this means that whatever is inside here now is dynamic. And inside here, we can now access the different properties inside our Vue component, including this URL property right here. So now I can type URL, and no longer is it just going to be literally URL. It's going to look for that value inside our component and output it right here, because we've said it's dynamic by using v-bind. So let me save that and preview. If we inspect this now, we can see over here, we get the URL property value that's defined in our Vue component. So this is how we use attribute binding. Now again, we tend to use this quite a lot in Vue projects. So instead of always having to write v-bind, we can get rid of that. And whenever we see just a colon, that means we're data binding to that attribute. So this is the same thing. It's just a shortcut for v-bind. Much like we have this @ symbol for events instead of v-on, we have colon for v-bind. And they're probably two of the main shortcuts that we use in Vue.js that are really helpful and that we use a lot. So let me just show you that this still does the same thing. Yep, still works. So we can do this with many different attributes, not just href. So let me comment this out, and you'll notice I've already created this assets folder right here, and inside this we have 3 images, 1.jpg, 2.jpg and 3.jpg, and they're each a book cover. So I want to use these for each book as we output them. So I'm going to create an image tag for each book at the top. So I'll say image, and then each one needs a source and an alt. Now the alt, we're going to bind to that, and to do that, remember, we can just use a colon, or we can say v-bind. I'm just going to use a colon, the shortcut, and I want the value to be the book title. So that is going to be the alt for the image. So let me paste that in. Now the source as well, I want this to be dynamic, but we don't have any kind of data property that we want it to be yet. So let's go over to these books and let's also create an image property for each one. So each image property is going to be basically a path, the source, to grab one of these. So they're inside the assets folder. So let's say assets/1.jpg for the first one. Now I'm just going to copy that so I don't have to type out each one individually because I'm super lazy. So 2, and then the third one, which is going to be 3. And by the way, these images are all found on the course files GitHub repo. If you just look at the lesson 13 branch right here, and you can see the assets folder, you can download the zip folder or go to each one of these individually and save it to your computer, entirely up to you. But they're all there. But anyway, now we've created these image properties, we can now bind to the source over here by using a colon. And because they're on the book that we have right here, the image properties, we can say book.image. And therefore, the source is going to be this for the first one, this for the second one, and this for the third one. So now, when we're outputting these, we should see all of those 3 images as well, which we do. So that is data or attribute binding. And again, we are going to be using this a lot as we go through the different chapters and projects in this course. Okay then, so now I'd like to show you how to use dynamic classes. And by that, I mean conditionally give elements certain classes based on a certain condition. So for example, for each book that we output, we might want to conditionally give this a class based on the value of something in each book. Now to demonstrate this, I'm going to add another property to each book called isFav, and that stands for isFavorite, and it's going to be a boolean, either true or false. So we'll say true for the first one, and I'm going to copy this and paste it a couple of times. We'll say false for the second one, and then for the third one, we'll say true. Okay, so now we have this isFav property on each one. Is it a favorite book? So what I could do is evaluate that property each time we cycle through a book and conditionally apply a class to this li tag based on that value. If that value is true, I might want to style the li tag a little bit differently. So what I'm going to do is now use some data binding. So we use the colon or v-bind, remember, and then a colon, and we're binding to the class attribute. Now, what I want to do is just use the shortcut instead of vbind, and that's what I'll be using going forward, by the way. And then inside here, we can pass in an object. Now, this object is going to contain key value pairs, and for each key value pair, it will be evaluated. The key will be the conditional class that we apply. So I might want this to have a class called fav, and then that will only apply based on the value of that key. If the value evaluates to true, then we'll have this class on the li tag. If it evaluates to false, then we won't have that class. So I'm going to reference the book, which we have right here, and then use the isFav property from that book. So that's going to be true for the first one, it's going to be false for the second one, and true for the third one. So the first and the third should have this fav class. So if I save that now and preview over here and inspect these, we can see that the first one has a class of fav, the second one doesn't because it's not a fav, it was false, but the third one does. So now we could style these a little bit differently. So what I'm going to do is add some styles to the whole page right here. I'm going to come up to the top. We don't need this box style anymore. That was from a few lessons back. And instead, what I'm going to do is just paste in a few different styles at a time, because I don't want you to watch me write these out. It's not a CSS course. So the body, we just give a background of a light grey, a max width of 960 pixels, a margin of 20 pixels top and bottom, auto left and right, meaning this 960 pixel column will sit in the middle. The next thing I want to do is strip out the margin and padding from the paragraph, H3 and UL. So we reset those. Then I want to style the li tags. So let me paste this in. And each li tag is going to have a list style type of none, meaning those little things right here disappear, those little circles. Then we give each one a background of white, margin 20 pixels top and bottom, auto left and right, a bit of padding, a bit of border radius to soften the corners. We display each one as flex, and that means that automatically each of these will sit next to each other inside the li tag. And then we align items to the center. That means that all of the items vertically sit in the middle. And then finally, we say justify content space between, and that means in the horizontal direction, we have equal space between each item. These things right here are used in conjunction with display flex. Now, if you do want to learn more about display flex, I've got a whole free course on my YouTube channel about Flexbox, so I'll leave the link attached to this lesson. But anyway, now we've applied those styles, let's take a look at what it looks like. Okay, so this looks a bit better, right? And now I want to style the ones with the fave class a little bit differently. So I could say down here, li.fave, and then inside here, I'm going to say we want the background this time to be a different hex color, and that will be FF9E and then D2. And that's kind of a pink color. So I also want the color of the text to be white, like so. So now, if we have that fave class, it's colored differently, and we can see at a glance which ones are favorites and which ones aren't. Now, throughout this course, I'm going to be giving you several different challenges so that you can test what you've learned so far. Now, you don't have to do these challenges, but I would highly recommend that you do, because it's in these moments where you're trying to figure out a problem for yourself that you actually learn the most, even if you don't figure that problem out, because you're still thinking about the concepts and thinking about how you might be able to solve it. And that is an important step in learning things, rather than just always watching what someone else is doing. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that you do these challenges. But anyway, the first challenge is to figure out a way to toggle the isFave property of each book when you click on that book on the screen. So right now, the top one has an isFave property value of true, and that's why it's pink, because of that dynamic class. Now, if I was to click this, I want you to then toggle that value to false, and then it would become white. And if I click it again, toggle it back to true, and so forth for each book, okay? Now, to do this, there's going to be two steps involved. The first step is to attach a click event to each li tag. And the second one is that when a user clicks that li, to toggle the isFave property of that book. So it's a relatively simple challenge to begin with, but they will get more taxing as we go through the course and learn more. But don't be disheartened if you don't figure this out, because it's still very early in the course and we've not had that much time to cement the knowledge that we've learned. So just spend a few minutes trying to think about it, and if you don't figure it out, check out my solution in the next video. So then, my friends, hopefully you had a good attempt at this challenge. If you didn't figure it out, don't worry, I'm going to show you my solution now. And your solution might be a little bit different, but generally they should be the same. So the first thing I'm going to do is come to the template, and I want to attach a click event to the li tag for each book. Remember, we get an li tag output for each book. If I just inspect over here, we can see that li, li, li. So that is the thing we want to attach a click event to. Now, to do that, I'm going to come over here and say @click and set it equal to a function. Now, that function is going to be called toggle fave. Now, you could have done it in line here if you wanted to, but I wanted to be a bit more explicit. So I've created this function, and I'm going to go over here and create this method. So toggle fave, and this is going to take in a value, and that value is going to be the book, because right here we need to know which book we are going to update. So I'm going to pass in the book as an argument right here, and we can just say book because we get that book right here. So we have access to it inside this click event, and we pass it into the toggle fave function. So I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to come to the component again and take in that book. Now, all I want to do is toggle what the value of isFave is. So there's a couple of different ways you can do this. The way I would do it is by saying the book, which we take in right here, dot isFave is equal to book dot isFave. So what that will do is say, okay, if the current value is true, reverse that, and then assign it to the value of isFav for that book. So that's all it's ever going to do. If it's true, it's going to reverse it to false. If it's false, it's going to reverse it to true. So that would toggle it either way. So if I save this and preview, let's see if it works. Click it and it unfavorites it. Click it again and it favorites it. Okay? And that works for each li tag. So again, you might not have done this exactly the same. There are numerous ways to do it, and this is just my solution. Now, there's one more concept that I want to discuss before we finish this chapter, and that is computed properties. So at first, when you start to use computed properties, it might all seem a little bit complicated, unnecessary, and strange, but they are really useful, and the more you use them, the more you see that, and we will be using them going forward. So, in a nutshell, a computed property is a way to define a data property inside our component that depends on other data that we have inside that component that we might have up here. So, for example, we might want to create an array which is called filtered books. Now, that filtered books array would depend on the books array that we have here. It's dependent on this data, and if this data changes, then our filtered array would change. Now, that filtered array might be an array of books whereby we only include books that are currently favorites. So how do we make this computed property then? Well, the first thing we do is we create a computed property inside the component object itself. Much like we have methods, we have computed as well. Then inside that, we create a function. So I'm going to call this filtered books. And this function will return a value. And then we can access that value by using this inside the template. So whatever we return here, we can access in the template. So if I just return, for example, a string saying hello, I know this makes no sense, but if I try to use this computed property inside the template, then it will give me that value. Now, I'm just going to do this at the top over here, paragraph tag, and I'll output filtered books, like so, and save it, and we can see we get this hello value, all right? So it works the same way as normal data properties in that respect. But we don't want to do this. We don't just want to return a value like this. Otherwise, we could have just done that up here. We could have created a property called filtered books inside the data object, which was hello. So this makes no sense. Like I said before, a computed property is a property that depends on other data. And then when that other data changes, this will update. Vue will look at that other data and update our value over here because it's dependent on it. So what I want to do is return a filtered array based on this. And to do that, I'm going to say take this .books, and remember that's how we access the different properties inside our component. We say this to reference the component, and then whatever data property we want. And I'm going to use the JavaScript method filter. Now, if you don't know what this method does, definitely check out the last chapter in this course where I go through different array methods. It's covered there. But essentially, this fires a callback function for each item inside the books array. And it's going to fire that function. And if we return true each time we fire that function, we keep that item in the array. If we return false, then we're going to filter that item out of the array. So we fire a callback function for each item, and then we need to return either true or false right here. Now, each time we iterate through, we get access to the book we're currently iterating. So I can pass it in right here, and I want to return true if it's a favorite. So I can just say book.isFav. Now, that is either going to be true or false as we cycle through. So as we fire a callback function for each item, the first one is true, so that remains in the new array. If it's false, it's taken out of the array, it's filtered out. That's what the filter method does. And we're going to end up with an array whereby this one is filtered out. And we should then only have this one and this one in it. And that is the value that we're returning, that filtered array. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go over to the template, and instead of cycling through the books, I'm going to cycle through filtered books now. And now we should only see the books which are favourites, which we do. Awesome. Now, if we change one of those by clicking it, it becomes not a favourite, and therefore we shouldn't see it. Like so. Like so. And then if we refresh, we get those books back. Okay? So that is computed properties for you in a nutshell. It's a way to define data properties which depend on other data. And again, we will be using them more in different places as we go forward.